Good afternoon and happy fourth Sunday in Advent to all of you. Christmas greetings too for when the day arrives. I hope I'm able to post this somehow. When I tried to post a Lord's Supper meditation this morning, I tried for over an hour, well over an hour in several different ways, but I couldn't get anything to work. Anyway, as I've mentioned several times, there are traditional themes for each of the 4 Sundays in Advent, but not every church uses the same theme on the same day. For the 4th Sunday, many churches use the theme of love. I was going to do the same, and others in our church were planning a Christmas program for today with the theme of love. Unfortunately, because of COVID, churches here in Hong Kong are again banned from meeting. My first thought was that I could go ahead and use the same theme, the same sermon online. But I've decided to postpone that for 1 week to see what happens about the ban on meetings. The last I heard, the government is extending the ban 1 week at a time, so I'm not sure if it's settled yet whether it will be enforced next Sunday or not. I suspect it still will continue until further notice, but it does have to end sometime. So if that happens this week, it would be nice to go ahead with the planned program on the 27th. So I decided to save the love theme, the love sermon, for a week or two in the hope that we can do that. Instead, I'm going to bring a message on a different theme related to Christmas. Every morning at 7:30, TVB Pearl relays a half-hour-long NBC evening news from the United States. Since that's when Karen and I eat breakfast, we usually watch the news while we eat. With Christmas approaching, one main news item in the last few weeks has been about Christmas shopping and Christmas gifts. Gifts are an important part of Christmas celebrations in most countries. And even though it's difficult to do Christmas shopping this year, many of us will still give and receive gifts this Christmas, as we do every Christmas. In this time of giving, I think it's also good to think not just about gifts to each other, but also about giving to God. And the title of my message is 5 Famous Gifts to God. One detail about the title of this message probably won't mean anything to most of you, but it was meaningful to me when I chose it. Enid Blyton was a famous British writer of children's books. When I was growing up, I read some of her books. I even have one myself still. One series was about a group of children who were friends and called themselves the Famous Five. There are many examples in the Bible of people who gave gifts to God or to Jesus. And when I was choosing some examples for this sermon, I very quickly had a list of 5. That made me remember the famous 5, so I stopped with 5 and called them the Famous 5 Gifts to God. Christmas traditions vary all over the world, but one of the most consistent is the tradition of giving gifts. People seem to have this tradition all over the world. There are probably 2 main reasons. One is that at Christmas, God gave us his Son, Jesus. The other is that a main part of this Christmas story is about the Magi, or wise men. They brought gifts to Jesus when he was still a very young child. So let's look at their gifts first. Matthew 2 tells us about the Magi and their gifts. We don't really know how many Magi there were. We sing about we 3 kings, but they probably weren't kings. The Bible never calls them kings. It's uncertain how many of them there were. One of the early traditions was that there was 12 of them. The reason that we talk about 3 of them is that we know they gave 3 gifts. and this has led some people to assume that there were 3 magi. What were the gifts? One was gold. We all understand what that is and what it was used for. Frankincense and myrrh were both resins from trees, from plants. But what were they used for, and what did the gift symbolize? The song We Three Kings tells us some symbolism for each of them, gold and frankincense and myrrh. Gold is a precious metal. It's used for money. It's used for making precious objects. It's also associated with royalty, both because kings are often rich and because crowns are often made of gold. Some see this as a symbol of Jesus as king. Frankincense is mainly used for making incense. Some see this as a symbol of Jesus as a priest of God, or even as a symbol that he was God himself. Myrrh was used for embalming bodies, and some see this as a symbol of the fact that Jesus would die for our sins. That raises the question, so why did the Magi give it as a gift to a baby? Did they know at the time what would become of him? It's possible, but myrrh did also have other uses. Like frankincense, it was used in incense. It is also used for medicine and especially as an anesthetic. For example, when Jesus was on the cross, he was offered vinegar mixed with something else. Matthew says mixed with gall, but Mark says it was mixed with myrrh. This was to either of those, myrrh or gall would have been in it as an ingredient to numb the pain and stop the pain as he was on the cross. Note that the Bible doesn't say that the gifts had these meanings. All 3 gifts were valuable, and frankincense and myrrh were especially the gifts of certain places. I believe one or both of them came from Yemen. So the Magi themselves may not have thought of any of these meanings. They may have just selected something valuable from their home countries. It's very common for people who are going from a place that is famous for some certain product to take that product, to take some of that product as a hospitality gift when they visit somebody. Besides the symbolic meaning of the gifts, which possibly no one even thought about at the time, since they were valuable, they were probably part of God's way of providing for the family on the trip to Egypt and back. Second famous gift is the donations for the tabernacle, for building the tabernacle. We read about this in Exodus 36, 1-7. After the Israelites had left Egypt, when God gave them his law on Mount Sinai, he gave them instructions to build a special tent or tabernacle for worshiping God. God gave certain people talents to oversee the work, and the people were to donate the materials. Moses invited the people to give, and they gave so much that after a while he had to tell them to stop giving. Can you imagine a preacher telling the church to stop giving? They had told them to stop giving because they had already given more than enough. Where did they get all of these rich materials to give since they'd been slaves in Egypt? The Bible says that when they were leaving Egypt, the people of Egypt gave rich gifts to them. This was a very unusual situation. You could say that in a way they earned these riches by all of the years of hard labor by them and their families in Egypt. But these things didn't come from their wages or money that they'd saved. The riches were gifts given to them. It was extra. But they had lived a life of poverty up until this time, so it's very likely that many of them would have wanted to hang on to it. Also, they were leaving an old life to start a new life in another country, and this was all that they had to provide a new start. These riches were given for God's glory, for building a place of worship in his honor. So their generosity and giving for this was probably came out of gratitude for God rescuing them from their life of slavery. Because of the change in their circumstances, they were very aware of what God had done for them. God also does great gifts for us, but we don't realize it unless we're brought down first. Sometimes God has to humble us to help us appreciate what we have. The third famous gift is David's altar, which we read about in 2 Samuel 24. In the background to this, God had commanded the Jewish people that they were not to take a census of how many people there were. But King David wanted to know how many fighting men he had in his country. He was surrounded by other enemies, had to go to war frequently, and he wanted to know how many fighting men he had to count on. And so he commanded a census. Since God had commanded them not to do this, God punished the land by sending a pestilence, a serious disease, probably killed even more than COVID. And this disease killed many people. David prayed for God to stop the plague, and the angel that was bringing it stopped at a certain place near Jerusalem, the threshing floor of a man named Araunah, the place where the wheat was threshed. A prophet named Gad told David that he should buy that threshing floor and build an altar there to make sacrifices in thanksgiving to God. When David went there to buy the land, Araunah told the king that he would give him the land, and not only the land, he would give him the oxen for the sacrifice, and the threshing floors, the threshing sledges and yokes for the oxen, for wood for the fire. But David refused the gift, and he insisted on paying for everything, saying, "I will not give offerings to God that cost me nothing." Fourth famous gift is the widow's mite, which we read about in Mark and Luke. I think we all know the story. Jesus was watching people put money into the treasury, and many rich people were putting in large sums of money and probably making a big show. "Oh, here's my money," plunk. But a poor widow put in 2 small coins, and she probably did it very kind of secretly, didn't want people to see how little she was giving. These were the 2 smallest coins that they had in use at that time, and they were not worth very much. Sometimes we get carried away by talking about how small they were and compare them to things that are hardly worth anything. But the point of the story is that she had something, and that something was all that she had, and yet she gave it. By Hong Kong, compared to Hong Kong money, it was probably a few dollars, maybe $5, maybe as much as $10, something like that. Worth enough to buy a snack, perhaps. Not worth enough for the rent, but something to live on with if she had nothing else. Note also that she could have just given 1. She had 2 coins. She could have just given 1, but she gave 2, which Jesus pointed out was everything that she had. Jesus said that in God's sight, she had given more than the rich people because they still had much more. So they didn't suffer any hardship. but the widow gave everything she had in the world. We read about the fifth famous gift in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9. There we read about the Macedonians who gave generously to help with relief money for Christians in Judea, where they were having a famine at the time. Even though the widow couldn't give very much, her gift was especially meaningful because she gave in spite of poverty. Some others who gave out of poverty were the Christians in the church at Macedonia. Paul says that even though they were poor, out of their great poverty, they gave generously. Now, they had been encouraged to do this when they heard about the faith promises of the Christians in Corinth. The Christians in Corinth had made generous promises. The Macedonians heard about their promises, and they decided to give generously themselves, even though they were extremely poor. Paul then uses their generosity, the example of their generosity, to encourage the Corinthians to honor their promises and to be even more generous. 5 famous gifts to God, 2 from the Old Testament, 3 from the New Testament, from different stages in the New Testament story. First from the time of the birth of Christ, then from Jesus' ministry on earth, and then finally from the life of the church after Jesus had returned to heaven. 2 of them were gifts from people who were rich. One was from people who had been poor but temporarily had riches, and they willingly gave out of these riches. 2 were from people who were very poor themselves, but they gave generously from the little that they did have, with one woman giving everything that she had. Sometimes in offering meditations and sermons, people seem to promote painless giving. Some people emphasize the passages that tell us that God will bless those who give, especially passages like Malachi 3:10 or 2 Corinthians 9:6-11. Some people even seem to teach that this is the way to become rich. Give to God, and He'll give back to you even more than you gave. So you will never be poor or needy again, because if you're giving generously to God, God will give so generously to you that you'll become, this is the key to riches. There's a name for that kind of preaching. It's called the prosperity gospel. And sometimes it happens, but I doubt if it happens very often if that is your motive for giving, to give so you can receive more. God is not going to be manipulated in ways like that. People who give for motives like that have an attitude and motive that is opposite to David's. They say, I'll give to God because I know it won't cost me anything. David said, I will not give to God something that costs me nothing. God will bless our giving, but not always by giving more money. God is more pleased with those who give generously in spite of their poverty than He is with people who give things that don't cost them anything. Right now we're in a situation where it's hard to give through the church because we're not meeting as a church. But in 1 Corinthians, the last chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul tells the Christians there that on the first day of the week they should lay by them in store, or store up their offerings, store up according to the amount that God had blessed them with. And so even though the church can't take up offerings right now, there are other ways, and There are other ways to give, and also, especially, we can store it up to give when we're able to, when the time comes. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for the chance to speak to you today. And somehow, whether it's in person or virtually through the internet, I hope we can meet again next week. God bless.